scavenger the entire regiment.
Cheers to all of you.
Cheers! 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 Here's to the last ration bullet.
Yeah!
Here's to survival.
Cross of Iron is a 1977 American war film, a box office disaster, directed by a past his prime Sam Peckinpah and deep into the alcoholism and addictions that would run him out of filmmaking. Not well received at the box office, not well liked by the critics. That means there's nothing more to say about this film, right? Wrong. You and I, we're free thinkers. So let's sit down, take a look, and talk about why this film matters. So what is Cross of Iron? Well, the film takes place in 1943, the defining moment of the 1,000-year Nazi Reich. Stalingrad has already been lost. It's not the end of the war, but you can see it from here. The German Empire recedes every week against the Soviet tide, and the borders of the German Empire are at the end of our protagonist's rifle. That's right, our protagonists are Nazis, of course, so...
Again, I always have to put in these disclaimers. This is not an endorsement of fascism.
This film doesn't shy away from Nazism, unlike a certain other famous film following the Germans' perspective.
Ich bin kein Nazi, Otto.
That's because Peckinpah is showing us, but not telling us, that we aren't so different from history's greatest villains, and that we can easily find ourselves in their shoes. Peckinpah goes back before any shooting even starts to show us how we got here. The film opens with stock propaganda footage of child life in the Reich. A children's song plays over crowd reactions to Adolf Hitler, including German youth. This is a recurring theme in Peckinpah's filmography, for as violent as his movies are, children and their observations of the adults around them feature prominently, and this film will be no different. A translation of the children's song is about little Hans, who goes out into the world and comes back a changed man, unrecognizable to even his own family. This tune continues as the footage shifts from Boy Scout-esque activities to war. Considering man's, especially young boys' need for competition, Cross of Iron asks, how could war not be an extension of these childish games? We all grew up with cops and robbers, and cowboys and Indians, King of the Hill. How could we not trick ourselves into thinking that this was the next logical step? This boyhood mentality brought up into the twisted, sick dogma of Nazi Germany, and then unleashed upon a world that they felt inferior. The footage turns to the war itself, the assaults, the battles, then the destruction and the massacres. All this machismo, all this chauvinism. It's a civilization drunk on itself, stumbling into the Stalingrad disaster and pulling millions of young men into early graves. Speaking of drunk, let's talk about the director. Sam Peckinpah was a veteran himself, serving in China and bearing witness to the atrocities the Japanese and Chinese would commit against each other and to themselves in this post-war world. Through his experiences grew an understanding of the core concept of the military, that it sucks you in, chews you up and spits you out if you're lucky enough and swallows you whole if you aren't. Peckinpah hated war. He hated the war America had just lost in Vietnam. He hated his time in the Chinese Civil War. All of this is important to Cross of Iron. War films aren't usually made by veterans. Fewer still ones that can really depict the chaos so accurately. So, as the audience, we see the compilation for what it was, Nazi agitprop. But for our protagonists, this was the great ideal. This was the reason to jump into action, to make a name for oneself, to earn that Cross of Iron. It's a wonderful opening. It has to be the best in 1977. Anyways, after the opening, the film introduces us to its heroes. We focus on two characters in particular, Sergeant Steiner, played by James Coburn, and Captain Stransky, played by Maximilian Schell. There are, of course, other characters too, but the story revolves around these two men. Steiner, who seems like our typical stoic, grizzled NCO, who leads a reconnaissance team and has the respect of every soldier and officer that serves with him. There's more to him, but we'll find more later. He is contrasted with a newly transferred Stransky, who comes from Prussian nobility, speaks often about his leisurely time in France, and talks highly about his ambitions for the current campaign, to win the titular Iron Cross, one of the highest awards for distinguished bravery on the battlefield. With the conflict going as bad as it is, there is no shortage of opportunity to earn one. But the problem is, Stransky is out of his depth. He's pampered, tightly wound, hardly the makings of a hero. So when he is face to face with one in Steiner, the two come to hostility in record time. This isn't to say that Stransky is a cartoon villain here, of course. He's manipulative, ambitious, and incompetent, but he's real. We've all met a Stransky. Some of us are closer to him than we'd like. Other films, especially war films, often depict these leaders as crazed cartoon characters.
I am Gunnery Sergeant Hartman, your senior drill instructor.
But when the two men finally sit down to have a conversation, they both reveal things to one another that illustrate that they are, after all, just men.
We're just innocent men.
Stuck with the same anxieties that we feel today. Even something as simple as making Dad proud. That's part of why this film stands out from its peers. A lot of war films are often structured around the idea of dehumanization, but Cross of Iron does something different. We start at the dehumanization. There is barely anything left to these men.
Hey, stop it! What the hell we are doing here? What do you think the hell we are doing here? Playing birthday games right in the middle of all that shit? You shut up when I'm talking!
And through the course of this film, we see the cracks, the glances, the brotherly touches, the memories they have of themselves before the war, and we see these men built up into likable characters. These soldiers get humanized. Most of all Steiner, that grizzled sergeant I mentioned earlier, the antithesis of the polished, beguiling Captain Stransky. We think Steiner is just a soldier, but these humanizing cracks begin to open him up. We find out that he has kids, that he's philosophical and articulate. In the second act of the film, he is transferred to a hospital far from the front, and shows that he is capable of song and dance and even romance. But all of this, his identity, is fleeting. His time in rehabilitation is a private war for his soul, tortured memories leaking out into reality, until he's unable to discern what is really happening to him. Steiner volunteers to go back to the front when his time is done. The war has won out in his mind. It is all he has left. And with slavish obedience, he trudges back to his slaughter. A mind so broken that the chaos of battle just makes sense. Now this might all sound like edgy, morally black schlock, but this is my next point. The violence. There's a word I want to use here. Verisimilitude. Noun. The appearance of being true or real. This movie is loaded with it. The fields are smothered in a thick smog. The dugouts are hastily set up. And the battlefields are rife with corpses that any frame could be a metal album cover. This paints a larger picture of the war than we just see from our characters, but also is artistic intention backed by real experiences of Peckinpah. There is hardly any heroic or villainous music in this film. Much of the plot is both sides committing war crimes against one another. The firefights are tumultuous, fevered dreams of slow-mo and blurry cuts. This was criticized on release as being the substandard work of a drunk, but I think it's artistic expressions of a man who just happened to be drunk. It is here, of course, that our story ends. I left out much of the plot only because if you haven't seen it, you deserve to watch it as spoiler-free as I can make it. Steiner and Stransky have their climax, and they go where the iron crosses grow. I will focus on these closing seconds of the film as a slideshow of atrocities continues past World War II and into more present conflicts like Vietnam. This is Peckinpah talking to you directly. This isn't a movie about Nazis and Soviets, which in our time are two long-gone nations, but this is a movie about war, the ugliness of war, his hatred of war, and why we should never wish for war. That is why this film matters.